Can we please take our seats? Thank you. Okay, so we are gathered here to have the launch of the book Satyagraha, the second expanded version of the book Satyagraha. As we all know, the Satyagraha was in 1961, 64 years ago. And it was a remarkable event insofar as it brought together all communities, although it was about the language policy that the Bandaranaike, Sirimavo Bandaranaike government instituted. It did bring out Tamils in the north, in the east, in the plantation community, and in the rest of the country. It brought out Muslims. It brought out the Malaha community, and it brought out women and men as well. It brought out the Muslim community, which I think is tremendously important for us to remember because of what happened to the relations between the Muslims and the Tamils later on in our history. Now, there is a temptation to compare the 61 Satyagraha to the 2024 Argalaya. And I suppose there are, in my opinion, superficial similarities. But I think the most important thing is that if there is an issue that is very strongly felt by the people in this country, and where the channels of communication in terms of the institutions of liberal democracy that we have set up, like Parliament, for example, are in some way blocked off to them, then they will take issues into their hand and come out. Now, granted, I think, I hope I'm not wrong in saying this, but I think that was probably the apex of the political career, if you like, of the Federal Party and of Mr. Chelvanayagam in terms of his leadership, because they insisted very strongly that, yes, we have to come out and protest the government's policy, but it has to be non-violent. And I think that was a tremendous achievement of the Satyagrahis, because in the face, first, of police brutality, and then the brutality of the armed forces, they never resorted to violence. And of course, the government declared a state of emergency and dispersed it and all of that. But it was a remarkable, maybe it was the last time in the history of this country, in that period, just over 10 years after independence, that there was a faith in democratic protest, in nonviolence, in that what I would call that old style politics, where you wanted to be able to sit down and negotiate. It wasn't about taking up arms of any kind. There was a faith in the democratic process, which of course didn't in the end be fulfilled, but nevertheless there was that. In the Aragalaya, for example, it was a very different sort of structure, if you like, in that it was horizontal in terms of the structure. There were politically organized groups or group, but largely it was leaderless in that respect. And where they called for system change, what they meant by system change was a very different story, because there were varying notions, versions of what they meant by system change. I was told that deep into the night there would be tremendous discussions and debates on whether the executive presidency should be abolished, what type of new constitution we should have. And one other thing, and of course, that is a sign of the times. There was, I would call it, a significant minority that didn't know of the significance of 1983. And that, I think, is the most shocking discovery with regard to the Aragalaya. They did not know. I mean, some I don't think even knew about 1983, but just did not know the significance of the most catastrophic event that happened in our political history. So, what does it say? I mean, the Satyagraha was about a very specific thing. It was about language as the target, but it was about the government of Sri Lanka accepting the Tamil people as equal citizens. But it was very specifically focused on language. The Aragalaya, on the other hand, was very much a consequence of frustration, of anger to a certain extent, but it also, for one brief moment, showed us what Sri Lanka could be like, insofar as it brought out Sinhalese, Muslims, Tamils, Hindus, Burghers, whatever, from working class to middle class. For one brief moment, the country came together in terms of that frustration. In the Satyagraha, there was an element of that, but insufficient. Because I think the ethnic dimension always creeps in. And in fact, as the book shows, there were on more than one occasion where government politicians were saying that, look, if we give in to if we concede your demands, what will the Sinhalese say? Or what do we say to the Sinhalese? And what will be our electoral prospects as a consequence? Yeah. So we have then a Satyagraha, we have 60 odd years later an Aragalaya. The question, I suppose, is are we going to have another one? And I think I would say that, look, given what has happened, given the brutality of the responses, and indeed even with regard to the Aragalaya, if we were to have another one, it won't be peaceful, is my opinion. It will make the previous one look like a tea party. Because, apart from anything else, it is going to be internal, it's going to be within the constituency that brought this government to power. It's internecine warfare in that respect. Secondly, the options of going out, I think, have fast narrowed. We have now a large singular diaspora, but that large singular diaspora is dwindling in terms of the number of people who can get out because of what's happening in the Middle East and the policies with regard to migration. So when in 1977, when Jayajewardena opened up the economy, as it were, yes, people didn't rush to get an AK-47, they rushed to get a visa. Likewise, when Ranil Wickremesinghe turned around and said that, look, these are the very people who wanted to grab power by marching on parliament and instituting a dictatorship, etc., the middle classes deserted the Aragalaya. They deserted the Aragalaya and they started looking for visas to go out. And over 500,000 of them have gone out. Over 500,000 have gone out. So next time round, if it is going to be this kind of thing, people feel trapped. Going out is not an option, I don't think. And so I hope I'm wrong and that it won't come to that, but there is a possibility that it could. And I will say one other thing as well and stick my neck out. I think the government is aware that this could well be the case. And that is why there is no particular hurry with getting rid of the PTA or the Online Security Act or turning the AG's office into a public prosecutor's office and all of that. Because I think it recognizes that, look, they will probably win the next election, but with nowhere near the majority that they have at the present moment, and dissent will increase. And when dissent increases, of course, the PTA, the USA, all of that are convenient tools of, let me use the euphemism, of managing dissent. And I think they are very much aware of it because, as I have always said, You know, the JVP is wedded to the IMF agreement. So, what is the real JVP government? When will we find out? Is it going to be 2027 or is it going to be 2028? Because 29 is going to be the year of the national elections. And what are they going to do with this huge majority that they have? So, the Satyagraha, which was largely spearheaded by ethnic minorities, of course, could have been dealt with an emergency and all of that. But, of course, by another 15 years, it became an armed insurgency. So we have to be careful in terms of how we deal with dissent, how we manage the consequences of the economic crisis that has beset us, and also think not just of the next 5 years, but perhaps the next 10 or 15. Because on top of all of this is also going to come AI, an aging population, and the very strong possibility that we are going to be linked much, much more than we could ever imagine to our big brother in the north. So, having said that, I now turn to Professor Urugama to make her remarks. Deepika, what's happened? You hear me? Deepika, can you hear me? Please go ahead. I, huh? I'm sorry, I can't hear anything, so ask her to speak. What did you think we were?
nation. So it's just not sufficient to say, well, we do have a constitution. We call it a democratic constitution, and in our case, we call the Republican constitution. We called our constitution 78 at least democratic socialist. Uh, it's not sufficient because the content of a constitution must, uh, for all purposes, practical and theoretical, encompass these principles. But now, when you look at the 72 Constitution, what is it that you find? The main idea that was presented by the Sri Lanka Freedom Party, the Lanka Samaj Party, and the Communist Party when it ran for election um, was in 1970 was that a new constitution would be drafted, of course, breaking away from the dominion status. And there were also a sort of a sense in the discussions that, led up to the formation of the government, that it would be a very inclusive government. That's the sense one gets from the discussions, because you see when the Constituent Assembly was formed uh, after the election, the Tamil parties were very enthusiastic, were extremely enthusiastic, and they participated enthusiastically on the basis that there was a great possibility of the demands of the Tamil polity being met, mainly, regarding the official language issue, the Single-Only Act of 1956, which caused such a major upheaval, and then power sharing, where the councils could be established in the north and east, and so on. But after the Constituent Assembly began to work, after all, the Constituent Assembly was nothing else but Parliament sitting in another location. There, according to a lot of the records of those and comments of those who were involved in the process, you do see things went downhill, to the extent that at a certain point the Federal Party walked out, because there were no breakthrough. There was no breakthrough in terms of the demands of the Tamil parties. And not only that, in terms of obtaining a democratic structure, that was absolute, I think, a major failure. Because on the one, I think the 72 Constitution can be characterized as being extremely one majoritarian, and on the other hand, extremely authoritarian. So in that sense, it really breached constitutionalism. On the one hand, you had all powers concentrated in the National State Assembly, the Parliament. Even judicial powers were channeled through the National State Assembly. And we are made to understand that this was because it was a sort of a socialist idea of the People's Assembly being the strongest organ of government. And executive power and judicial powers too were first vested in the Parliament, or in our case, the National State Assembly, and then channeled to the judiciary and then to the executive. And so it really did weaken judicial independence. And on the other hand, it also really weakened independence of the civil service, which has had terrible consequences for this country. Then, in terms of inclusivity, creating a constitution that was inclusive, it went just in the opposite direction, because Sinhala as the only official language, which earlier had only a statutory position, then enjoyed under the 72 constitutional status, because the constitution proclaimed that Sinhala is the only official language. And then on top of that, in a quite an unexpected move, there was Article 6 that was introduced, which recognized that Buddhism shall be given foremost place. So this was absolutely, I think, the sort of degeneration of the discussions and the moves on the part of the Constituent Assembly is really from an outside point of view hard to understand, but I think when you look at the fact that the Constitution was drafted almost without the aid of public views, because even though public views were called, they were hardly given, I don't think there was even a mechanism to really channel the public commentaries and public views, etc., into this, the drafting process. So it was entirely about the ruling party, the the coalition, having its own way, and various components of that coalition having its own way. So we ended up with that constitution, and at a certain point, as I pointed out, the Federal Party just walked out. It walked out in the sense it said we are no longer going to participate because it is of no use. So while there was a great degree of anticipation at the beginning, it just fizzled out. And the second Republican Constitution, too, promised to do away with a lot of those negative features of the 72 Constitution. So instead of concentrating powers in the parliament, what it did was, of course, concentrate powers in the very all-powerful executive presidency, which today also we say we really want it abolished because it hasn't worked very well for Sri Lanka over the years. Of course, there's a debate about it, but this is something that we really need to take up, and the current government also in its manifesto, in the president's manifesto, has pointed to the fact that it should be abolished. And on the other hand, 1978 Constitution also continued to recognize Sinhala as the only official language, and it also has this Buddhism clause which says that states should give foremost place to Buddhism and so on. Interestingly, both Republican constitutions did contain fundamental rights chapters, because I saw in the book, in the book on the Satyagraha, it is said that if the Salisbury Constitution did have a fundamental rights chapter, it would have been so much better. Well, both Republican constitutions did contain fundamental rights chapters, which both included equality provisions. And the 72 Constitution, of course, did not recognize a specific remedy for violations of rights, whereas the 78 Constitution went even further and recognized and provided for a specific, what we call a sui generis, a very special remedy where violations of rights were concerned. But then what happened? Things really went out of control, as we know, in 83 with the pogroms, and then the beginning of a civil war, a sense that this was not a state where all segments of society felt safe or welcome. That was absolutely not there, and there were all these assaults on democratic institutions such as the judiciary and so on. So if I were to go back to the Independence Constitution, the Salisbury Constitution, on the other hand, it may have been accused of not being autochthonous or not being homegrown, but in a way it was homegrown because it was drafted on the basis of the proposals put forward by the Board of Ministers at that time, and Mr. T.S. Naika played a very major role in its drafting. It was, in a way, very devoid of strong ideologies, except to say that it was a very liberal. It was a constitution in the liberal tradition. It had many features of constitutionalism. Separation of powers was highly recognized. There was no concentration of power on any particular organ of government. Judicial independence was highly respected. There was independent judicial service commission. There was also a very strongly independent public service commission, which ensured that the public service was independent. And yes, of course, it didn't have a fundamental rights chapter, but it had the all-important Article 29(2) of the Constitution. So I think, the point is, we see in 72 and 78 constitutions, even with chapters on fundamental rights, and 78 Constitution with a remedy for violation of fundamental rights, it really didn't mean that Sri Lanka became a more inclusive place where people's rights were well protected and everybody felt safe and wanted and respected, where they could live a life of dignity. So in that sense, I think 29 too. And here I should also mention Saliva Jennings, who was an advisor, was the main advisor to the drafting of the Solberry, the Independence Constitution. He took a very strong position that it was really not necessary to have a human fundamental rights chapter, because his position was that in England, in common law tradition, rights were protected by the courts. Because in England, UK, as we know, does not have a written constitution. It is an unwritten constitution, and it was pointed out that the judiciary will play a very major role in protecting the rights of the people. The Salisbury Constitution had really, given pride of place to judicial independence. So there was that expectation that the judiciary will protect all the rights. And on top of that, there was Article 29.2, which prohibited discriminatory legislation and also legislation that would interfere with religious freedom of any community. Now, I think it was a very strong constitutional formulation. The only problem was that in practice, the judiciary, with due respect, did not give expression to Article 29.2 as anticipated. The core value of Article 29.2 of ensuring non-discrimination, because both challenges to the Single Only Act and the Citizenship Act of 1948 were not successful. The judiciary did not strike down either piece of legislation on the basis that it violated Article 29.2. So historically, when we look back, we see that those were really negative moments, and I say this with due respect to the judiciary, because if indeed the judiciary did deliver without standing on technicalities, which included also the Privy Council, because the Privy Council also contributed to those judgments, maybe Sri Lanka would have gone on a different trajectory, but you can't say that for sure. Because I think the post-independence political culture of first Ceylon and then subsequently Sri Lanka really did not, in my opinion, especially in the later years, and especially in the Republican era, did not clearly show a commitment to that deeper form of democracy. And so to bring my presentation to an end, this is why I was very excited about the Aragalya in 2022. Because if the Satyagraha of 1961, was a peaceful demonstration of a group of citizens of this country who wanted to live in dignity, by mainly demanding that they be able to use their language, their mother tongue, and was treated, very harshly. What was exciting about the Aragalya to me was that it was in a way sort of a revival of this demand for inclusivity. There were many things demanded by the Aragalya, mainly about responsible government, accountable government. There was this strong anti-corruption message. But I think one of the most prominent messages in the early months of the Aragalya was that we do not want divisive politics. We want a state that is based on equal citizenship, and we do not want divisive politics, and call the bluff of the political establishment. And so in the Aragalya, to some extent, all communities participated. I know that there were certain dynamics that we can discuss further, but I think there was this very strong message of inclusivity. And even though the Aragalya was, very brutally crushed, I think that spirit hopefully lingers on. And now it's really up to us to say that, we no longer want just to keep protesting. Yes, in a democracy, protests are inevitable, peaceful, some may be violent. We had a 26-year-old civil war. We had 2 insurrections in the south. But the point is to say that, we should now seriously start state building, and that constitution making should really not be the preserve of the political establishment, as we saw, uh, you know, where all three constitutions were concerned, but mainly the two Republican constitutions. They were not about the people. They were really drafted by political parties in power or coalitions in power to pursue their own political agenda. So now we have to really get back to this discourse on constitutional reform from a totally different position. And in my opinion, demanding that the constitution making process be taken away as much as possible from the political establishment, and that a separate constituent assembly be elected, as in Nepal, as in other countries, like South Africa, for example, separate constituent assembly being established, consisting of citizens from various communities, from various interest groups, to come up with a blueprint of a constitution. And then, of course, the parliament has to get involved in its adoption. But until we get to that point, I think we are going to be struggling. But I think still in that struggle, the peaceful protests like the Satyagraha movement, and the Satyagraha in 1961, and then the Aragalaya, which was also largely very peaceful until it was attacked very brutally, um, you know, have played a very key role. And I think, learning from those experiences, we've got to push this agenda for a very people-oriented and inclusive constitution making process. So thank you very much once again for the opportunity, and I look forward to the discussion. The only thing is I need a way to get involved with the discussion. So I hope you will facilitate that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Deepika, for that very comprehensive. Well, I don't know what. Well, we can't get through to her because she can't. Yes, someone needs to say that to her on the phone. Right? Yes. Thank you. Thank you, Deepika, for that very comprehensive overview of our constitutional journey and what confronts us as we embark on the next phase, hopefully fairly soon, of this constitutional journey. So without much further ado, can I ask Dr. Ratneswaran to make his presentation with regard to, make his presentation with regard to the book. Can I? Talk.
Now I can talk. Okay. Mr. Chairman, Sarah, and our guest of honor, Professor Padmanabhan.
The mic is fine. The mic is fine.
Okay. I could see I'm not a professional speaker, so you have to put up with me for the time being. And Mr. Chairman, Sarah, and our guest of honor, Professor Padmanabhan, and our speakers, Deepika, Neil, and Sumandran. And ladies and gentlemen, may I warmly welcome you this evening for the launch of this book. Now, can you get that one? This is the book that I'm talking about, and now you'll see the revised edition here in circulation. Unfortunately, our second guest of honor, Professor Yongada, who contributed for the book, couldn't be attend here because of personal health reasons. And Mr. Vijayabalan, who assisted me, worked with me in editing the book, also couldn't be here. They send their apologies. This book has been several years in the making. May I start with a few words about my personal journey that led me here today. Born after Sri Lanka's independence from British Empire in 1948, I have always felt that my life story is intertwined with post-independent Sri Lanka. Within me, there has been a constant tension between the armed conflict on the one hand, its violence, destruction, and a cost in human life, and on the other hand, the socio-political injustices, drivers that fostered unrest since 1956, again 1983, and indeed continues to do so today. Satyagraha refers to the 56 days of peaceful, non-violent public protest against the Sri Lankan government's Sinhala-only Act. This act made Sinhala the single national language of the island with a view to the overnight marginalization of the 25% of the population who did not speak Sinhala. Satyagraha protest started on 20th of February 1961 outside the Jaffna Kacheri and subsequently spread to the northern and eastern provinces. It continued daily, growing support across all three communities, as our chairman mentioned, the Muslims, the Tamils, and the Sinhalese. However, it ended abruptly and violently 56 days later, April 17th, when the government called a state of emergency. In the 24 hours that followed, armed forces traveled from Colombo to Jaffna and enforced physical acts of violence on the Satyagraha protesters. Fast forward to 1991. I found myself in a second-hand bookshop in Jaffna. I stumbled on a copy of the book Satyagraha, that particular book. This took me back to the peaceful movement in 1961 in Jaffna when I was only 13 years old. Today, after many years of divided feelings of the armed conflict, I still firmly believe in the importance of the Satyagraha moment. For me, that was a defining moment in our history where our politicians turned to the Sinhala-only Act, an act of nationalism. In that moment, they choose not to hear the voices of objections, or rather not to listen. Instead, they called upon state violence to silence those voices. I would argue that this was our golden missed opportunity for conversation, for cohesiveness, and plurality. It was mentioned by Sarah earlier. And yet, this moment in our history is rarely spoken of. It has been lost in the sound and fury of consequence of violence. I would suggest that it was I would suggest that if we turn back to this moment and we re-examine the events, the stories, and the context of the original protest, we can understand how we arrived at violence, economic failings, and democratic disgrace. And so it was with a sense of urgency for a fragile future, we set out about editing this original text with careful attention to sourcing the original references. This revised edition contains further details of the background to the original Satyagraha movement in 1961 And reference is also made to the preceding 56 movements and the violence against the Tamils in 56 and 58. Pontiac had witnessed the 1961 event firsthand as a man of 40, wrote the original text a year later. Pontiac was an advocate by profession, and he writes in the third person throughout the book, but moves with remarkable agility from a detailed description of historical events to a deep knowledge of the political discourse and context. It makes this piece of writing truly authentic, compelling, authoritative. Sadly, this book and largely peaceful events of Satyagraha in 1961 went unheeded by the government until later emergence of armed conflict. The single-only act of 1956 and event that subsequently unfolded marked the beginning of the darkest period of our community relations in Sri Lanka's history. Now, the guns have been silenced, but the unresolved aspiration of the Tamil community to have a Sri Lankan Tamil identity, recognized along Sri Lankan single identity, continued to fester. Of course, nationalism and ethnic conflict are not only topical emotive issues here in Sri Lanka, but also in many parts of the world. It is our misfortune that a blind ultranational remains a burning issue in our country. But there's, there is a glimmer of hope, and with recent political changes in the country, let us therefore remain positive and hopeful. Back to you, sir.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, let's hope that we can sustain the form that you spoke about. So without further ado, may I invite Professor Ian Gordon from the Department of Politics and International Affairs at Great Forest University. Professor Gordon has written extensively as a surveyor. So we have.
Well, thank you so much, Sarah, and thank you to Mario and the ICES for organizing this, and to Dr. Ratneswaran for updating this volume. I know that this has been a labor of love because we have discussed this volume at least since about 3 years ago, when I tried to help you get a speech that Mrs. Bandaranaike had delivered. And I don't think I succeeded, but I got some other stuff for you. Um, okay, is that better? Okay. So as I said, this has been a labor of love, and I'm fully aware of it. And it's very satisfying to have this book as it's being presented to us today. And even though the photographs are rather grainy, they're just fascinating photographs. You know, it's a moment in history of this country uh, that could have turned out differently, and that's something that I'm going to touch on in my comments. Uh, what you have here is basically a very detailed social movement that is being captured with a degree of granularity that becomes richer, I think, as the more we move away from it, you know, period wise. Um, Ratnes has mentioned 56 and 58, and I kind of refer to the Satyagraha or kind of take it in uh, by compressing it into a trifecta of events over a period of 5 years. And that's the singular only bill in 1956, the anti-Tamil riots. Well, they were not just anti-Tamil, because Tamils also resorted to rioting in 58 in the north to some extent over the Shri number plates. And then we have the 61 Satyagraha. And uh, these three events are seminal in the sense that they were moments in time in this country's post independence history where, if the leaders of this country had the courage to change the route that they were embarked on, the story of this country could have been very, very different. And I'll get to this a little later. Because in political science, we have a line of theorizing called path dependence, and it has to do with how we end up on a path. And the further we stay on that path, it becomes very, very, very difficult to change course. And that does not bode well for Sri Lanka in terms of its ethnocracy, because we've now been on this path for a good 65 years, long actually, almost 70 years. The Satyagraha can be seen as a discrete event. That's a singular event. Okay, is that better? Yeah. It can be seen as a discrete event. No two protest movements are similar, or there's variation. So if you think of the 61 Satyagraha and the Aragali of 2022, there are some similarities, but there are also many differences, because they're taking place in different moments uh, in history. If you just take the last couple of years, there have been a number of protests around the world. You had the protest movement in Bangladesh last year, and then this year we've seen protests in Morocco, in Kenya, in Madagascar, in Nepal, um, in Peru, where you had a change initiated there, same in Nepal. Uh, hmm? Yeah, so a number of protests. The only common denominator, as far as I can see, is that these have been led by the so-called Generation Z. But otherwise, they all differ, uh, and so uh, and they're all been in countries that are, for the most part, democracies, flawed democracies, illiberal democracies, if you will, except for Bangladesh, because I think Bangladesh would qualify to be called authoritarian at the time that Sheikh Hasina was driven out, because the Awami League had just, had gotten to be so brutal. Um, so I actually think of the Satyagraha uh, not so much as a discrete event. Of course, it's a discrete event because every event can be considered discrete. I think of it as a continuous event, one that uh, was necessitated by events that preceded it. The Sinhala only act and the Shri, the riot stemming from the number plates, all the other policies that were anti-minority, specifically anti-Tamil. And I also see it as conditioning events that followed it. If the legitimate demands of the Satyagrahis had been kind of accommodated to some extent, we most likely would not have seen a separatist conflict in the North. Because I find it interesting, and somebody can correct me if I'm wrong, but from everything I've read, while there were Tamil politicians in parliament like Mr. Sundaralingam and others who were talking about a separate state, you know, uh, in the late 50s, uh, the youth of the North did not mobilize or talk about mobilizing violently until after the Satyagraha. Uh, I'm assuming there must be a link there because they would have realized that peaceful protests were not going to, make any gains in terms of the injustices that they had faced. And so I see the Satyagraha as kind of a harbinger of what transpired uh, and culminated in this 26-year civil war. Uh, and in some ways, you could think of the Aragalaya again a discrete event, but part of a continuous process because it's connected to the politics associated with this ethnocracy that leads to a situation in the country where we have absolute political decay, because ethnocracy is able to be used to mask all sorts of other nefarious practices. And so I think in some ways you could think of the Aragalia as a harbinger of the MPP coming to power. And it's only been 1 year since they came to power, since they've been in power. But and maybe it's too soon to judge uh, in what direction they may end up taking this country. The MPP looks to me like a very neoliberal you know, assortment in many of its policies. But at the same time, uh, there are these comments that get made about the party having to be in control for the next 20 years and the like, which causes one to be a bit uneasy. And this is a party that was, the JVP at least, was a 3% party in terms of, its vote base. And now it's come to power after all these years. On the positive side, you could say that they stayed the democratic course despite being a party with a 3% base. On the other hand, you could say that now that they've captured power, uh, how likely are they going to relinquish power when things don't go their way down the road? So that's we'll need to wait and see. And I could identify with Sarah's commentary in terms of a potential future protest movement that could turn out to be very violent. Um, now, uh, the Satyagraha, I think, discredited Tamil politicians, moderate Tamil politicians, because to the youth at least, who are being increasingly marginalized economically, then educationally, as we get to the standardization policies. Um, it's understandable as to why they felt that violence was perhaps the only means. I'm not trying to justify what happened, but you know, um, I have a Jewish friend who says that if he were a Palestinian, he would be branded a terrorist as well. Because I mean, what do you expect a Palestinian to do when, they've been forced to deal with this continuous injustice? And in many ways, that's what Tamils have faced. Now, what leads to protests? Okay. Uh, One should not also forget the 53 protest, the Hartal, which led to the downfall of a government, just like the Aragalia led to a downfall of the government. There are three, I think, main reasons for protest, and these are overarching reasons. One is economic stress, one is ethno-nationalism, and one is authoritarianism. Any one issue could be the main driver, but oftentimes these kinds of movements incorporate multiple factors. So the 1961 Satyagraha could be seen as a counter to majoritarian nationalism. But there was also, I think, an economic basis for it, because the way in which politics had unfolded up to that point in time was clearly going to penalize Tamils uh, who had benefited by their disproportionate representation in government service. And so there were economic considerations, obviously, behind the protest. But in the main, it was a protest for basic rights. And so you could think of it as one that was mainly influenced by uh, uh, majoritarian nationalism. Uh, the Aragalia is mainly influenced by economic stress. Uh, the middle classes of Sri Lanka would not have shown up to protest, if they were not been, if they were not hurting in terms of, not being able to get basic necessities. And so it was clearly other things did contribute, but it was mainly economic in terms of the impetus for the Aragalia. Now, what I'd like to do is to try and connect the Satyagraha with the Aragalaya. Again, while noting that these are, on the one hand, very discrete events, but they are also part of a continuous story uh, in post-independence Sri Lanka. So I mentioned path dependence, and path dependence basically is this idea about how a sequence of events and policies can unleash outcomes that can be very, very hard to reverse. Uh, so basically, you make decisions that take you down a road or a path that makes changing course extremely difficult for political reasons. So if you think of the Bandaranaike-Chelvanayakam Pact, okay, there's the recognition that, you know, this injustice to Tamils uh, should be ameliorated, but at the same time, you have now gone down this path that makes it very, very hard to reverse course. Um, in the literature on part dependence, uh, there is a concept called increasing returns. And what this means is that the more you stay on a given path that you've chosen to travel on, the more benefits start to accrue to certain communities. And in the Sri Lankan case, most of the benefits that have accrued uh, uh, have been to, the majority community, and in the form of economic and political power. Uh, so, if you think of new constituencies that have come to pass as a result of staying on this path. The Sri Lankan military today is more powerful than ever in terms of influencing decision making. That was not the case 20 years ago or 30 years ago. So now it becomes even harder to reverse course because not only are you dealing with the clergy, which have been powerful since the 50s especially, but now you have this other constituency which carries arms. uh, and so, whatever system change that this government is going to initiate, it may be change on uh, the economic front. I don't think it's going to be much change when it comes to altering the kind of, you know, ethnocentric basis of Sri Lanka. Um, so I wish I could be a bit more positive. Um, in my recent writing, I've used the word kakistocracy, and again, this is the kind of a highfalutin political science term that refers to uh, some of the most venal and predatory and subpar leaders a country can end up with. Kakistocracy, yeah. And we're not going to include Mr. Sumantiran, in this group, obviously, uh, but because we have good leaders. I mean, we have good, decent people in government. But when you look at all that has transpired in terms of the political decay that has affected this country, you know, it is intricate. It's intimately connected to this kind of ethnocentric path that this country embarked on. Some of the things that Deepika referred to in terms of independent commissions, being made important and just jettisoned, uh, which in turn allowed in the especially the Mrs. Bandaranaike government of the early 70s. Uh, to change the professionalism of how government functioned, civil servants functioned, the judiciary functioned. Uh, there's a line in Bradman Viracone's book, uh, his autobiography. Um, uh, it's a lengthy title, but he has this line about some of the changes that were made to the independent civil society, and he says that this was done so that the government of the day felt the government of the day felt that the civil servants were not keeping up with the kind of expectations of the majority committee or something like that. And so the change was made. So these civil servants were made important or just gotten rid of, uh, so that the agenda of the nationalist, if you want to put it that way, got effectuated. So I see a lot of what has transpired in this country, including the bankruptcy, being connected to the path that Sri Lanka followed, which was in the main an ethnocentric path. And I unfortunately uh, am somewhat negative in terms of being able to change course. That doesn't mean that things cannot improve. Things can improve on multiple fronts. Uh, but the majoritarian nature of this uh, the political structure, I don't think is going to change. And therein, I think there has to be some major change in that regard if this country is truly going to experience system change. So I'll stop there.
Thank you. Thank you, Neil, for that very interesting and perhaps even in some parts provocative presentation. In terms of the institutions of liberal democracy, the army, Lake House, were two major institutions that the Sri Lanka Freedom Party had their eyes on. The army, after the 1962 coup, Lake House, which eventually happened in the 1970s, because the argument is that they all represented the establishment, and the establishment was UNP. There was no alternative to it, and so therefore they had to take over and rebuild, if you like. And so we got the major changes that happened. But anyway, let's come back to that. So now let me turn to Sumandran to talk about the future challenges of constitutional.
Yeah. Thank you, Sarah. Um, uh, Guest of honor, Professor Padmanathan, Professor Neil Devota, Professor Deepika Udagama, and my dear friends. First, let me thank Dr. Ratneswaran and others who brought out this monumental work. It's a very, very important publication. He showed us that faded book that was written in 1962 by Mr. S. Ponnaiah. People may not have even realized that there was something written on this, if not for your work. He tells me that they are translating this into Tamil and in Sinhala also, which I think is very, very important. I've been introduced as the General Secretary of the ITAK, Langai Tamil Katchi, the federal party, if you like, in the invite, and asked to speak on collaborative approach to constitution making in Sri Lanka. Well, after listening to the presentations by those who spoke before me, I thought I'll touch on a few matters before I speak my mind with regard to future or envisioning. The topic says envisioning a collaborative approach. In 1956, when the first Satyagraha took place, it was at Golface Green. And in 2022, at a public meeting at the public library in Colombo, speaking to the Aragalais of that day, when I told them, you're not the first people to, launch this struggle on Golface Green. Exactly 66 years ago, because that was also, I think the date was July 5th or 6th or something like that. Some of the Tamil political leaders sat at the Golf Age Green, and this is how it ended. They were roundly beaten up, and I have read in these pages how that took place and how Prime Minister of the day, S.W.R.D. Bandaranaike, nonchalantly said, let them have a taste of it, and continued to say so while they were beaten badly. I think that was the first Satyagraha, if you like. There was, of course, Rice Hartal in 53, but a non-violent Gandhian style protest, silent protest, was 1956 and here in the capital city of Colombo. And that's how it ended. Now, different forms of protests have been talked about, and even this book uh, tries to make a comparison between the 56 to 61 period nonviolent protests and the Aragalaya. I think it's two different stories. It's two different era, completely different contexts. Because when I spoke to them about that Satyagraha, I mean, most of them were not born. Even I wasn't born at that time. But there was no sense of, understanding or even an empathy that such things happened in this country. In 61, of course, as this book explains in great detail, months of protest, I think 56 days is what you said. The whole civil administration in the north and east was crippled. And the pictures show how ordinary people participated in that Satyagraha. They came, they sat on the road, blocked the pathway to kacheris and other administrative buildings, withstood assaults, but only when emergency was declared and mounted police was sent to Jaffna, and horses were set on the Satyagrahis. It is said that Mr. Chelvanayagam called off the Satyagraha, considering the serious injuries and even deaths that might be caused to the Satyagrahis. I'm not very sure of that account. Of course, we have children, grandchildren, and great-grandchild of those two leaders at that time, S.J.V. Chelvanayagam and Dr. E.M.B. Naganathan, in the room with us. And they probably know more details of. It is also said, the accounts say that Mr. Chelvanayagam was never assaulted, not in Golface, not in front of the Jaffna Kacheri. But Dr. Nirmala, your father was the one chosen for the worst kind of attack, physical attack. Yeah. For some reason, that was the case. They probably feared that the feeble Mr. Chelvanayagam may not withstand a physical attack. But they bore it. The point is that in Gandhian style, they bore it. They didn't lift a hand against those attacks, although they were in large numbers in 1961. So that is, I think that was in the minds of the youth of the 70s when they look back and saw what happened, the result of non-violent protests. If there had been one success story after Mahatma Gandhi, I think it is only Martin Luther King Jr., who professed and led a protest of civil disobedience. But thereafter, if you look around, the changes that have been brought about may not have been violent, but not in the Satyagraha model of peaceful sit-in, movements. Those who grew in that culture, particularly Mr. Sambandhan, tried it a few times. In the 2000s also, I sat with him in Sampur when Sampur was not released. Token Satyagraha protests we had in Valigamam North, in Sampur, and so on. But quickly to come to constitution making, in it was in 1926, 100 years ago, uh, that the same SWRD Bandaranaike is the person who introduced the federal idea to this island. No one else, right? Wrote 5 letters to the Ceylon morning leader, did that famous Jaffna lecture. I have often wondered why he did a Jaffna lecture. He was trying to convert the Jaffna leaders to the federal idea. How ironic is that? Um, so we propose to start a federal movement when we hit the 100 years, um, as a legacy of Mr. Bandaranaike's own idea. But 30 years later, he proposed Sinhala language only, the official languages act. And he tried to uh, backpedal a little. He was killed, of course. And that's been the story of every leader in the country. Dudley Sennaika marched to Kandy. That picture is there. Often said that J.R. Jayawardena marched to Kandy against Banda Chelva Pact. But you can see very strong Dudley Sennaika with this sarong lifted with one hand, walking alongside J.R. Jayawardena to Kandy in protest against Banda Chelva Pact. And then when it came to the turn of Dudley Sennaika to sign a pact in 1965, there were protests from the other camp, and that had to be abandoned in 1968. Yet, in the 1970 general election, the federal party's election manifesto, very specifically called on the Tamil people not to vote for any Tamil party that called for a separation of the country. Because by that time, Mr. V. Navaratnam, who was the general secretary of our party in 1957 when the Banda Chelva Pact was signed, he's there in the pictures when Chelva and Banda shaking hands, had started a new political party and had called for a separate state. He was defeated. It was a federal party that became the main political. People returned the federal party as a main political party, even in 1970 general election. As was said, it was the separate state idea came much, much earlier in the 50s. There is a book written by C. Sundarlingam, then MP, that's titled Ilam, The Beginnings of Freedom Struggle. Only that he spelled Ilam as EYLOM. And I think even Mr. Tyagaraja, who later joined Mrs. Bandaranaike's government in the 70s, who won the election in 1970, defeating Mr. Amadalingam in Vatukotte, also called for a separate state well before that. So there were calls for separate state by others, but the federal party, the main Tamil political party, called on the Tamil people not to vote for political parties that called for a separate state in 1970. And it is only the making of the first Republican Constitution, uh, falsely called the autochthonous Constitution. I say falsely called the autochthonous Constitution because it was out and out majoritarian Constitution. Article 6 said foremost place to Buddhism. Article 7 said only official language shall be Sinhala. What more than that to describe it as a majoritarian Constitution? It was only after that and 4 years down the line that actually the Federal Party, along with others, formed Tamil United Liberation Front and called for a separate state. And by which time the youth, there are two factors, I think, who turn them to violence. One, perhaps the lessons they learned from the leaders not being successful. The second was definitely standardization policies that threw them out of tertiary educational institutions, that sent them, their parents, to mortgage their properties, sell their properties, and send their sons only those days were sent for higher education to England. And those days they sent people only to England for higher education. And it's no surprise that the first two uh, uh, armed Tamil youth movements were student movements. One, EROS, Elam Revolutionary Organization of Students. The other was GUES, General Union of Elam Students. Both were started in the UK, not here. Thank you, by the youth who were disenchanted, who were disappointed, and who felt a sense of betrayal and discrimination, started on that. And then we know the history of that. Dr. Ratneswaran talked about the dilemma or the struggle that he faced with regard to armed struggle and, the privation of attacks on Tamils. Uh, that's I think uh, the kind of feeling that a lot of people have in the Tamil polity. Not me, but a large majority of the Tamil people have, wondering how else can we, stand against this brutality, this discrimination, this blatant violation, and so on. So the question that arises today is Satyagraha the way? Well, I firmly believe, if not in the form of Satyagraha, certainly a non-violent, a persuasive force is the way. I, for one, do not subscribe to the view that a violent or an armed struggle will win the day. We've tried that for 30 years, but even without that experiment, I would say that's not the way. But what is the way then for those numerically in the minority to persuade preponderantly majority in numbers of the state, uh, who sometimes suffer from, this is not said patronizingly, but who sometimes suffer from a minority complex, given the region, the world, and all of that. Uh, but I think the answer lies in how the 61 Satyagraha happened, where we had support from a total support from the Muslim community, absolutely total support from the Muslim community, and also support from Sinhala leaders as well. So yes, of course, that's a topic you've given me, collaborative, envisioning a collaborative, movement. Looking at South Africa's black people's liberation too, you're often confronted with the fact that liberally minded whites in South Africa, fought alongside the blacks for their redemption. And that was a key factor. That was a key factor that made the world turn and look in their direction, because then the world sits up and notices, yes, this is a justice issue. This is not just one, community saying one thing, another community saying another thing, but there is a justice issue here, and take note. So I think collaborative approach is certainly the way to go. And 61 Satyagraha was for language rights. 30 years later, or in 57 was Sinhala, the Official Languages Act. It took 30 years or 31 years to change that on paper. 13th Amendment, and thereafter in 1988, the 16th Amendment to the Constitution. He changed it on just on paper. I'm saying that, stressing that, because just 4 days ago I was in the magistrates court in Valechene, appearing for three of our local council members who were accused of removing name boards installed by the Department of Archaeology. And the police filed their report in court only in Sinhala. Only in Sinhala. Language of administration in the north and east shall be Tamil. The constitution says the language of court shall be Tamil. Article 26 of the constitution says. And yet, to this day, almost another 30 years after that amendment was made, still Sinhala is a language that the police will file their reports in court. The situation is very different in most of these places. A lot of things have changed, of course, but that day it was that. And I raised the issue in court and I said, well, you are producing arraigning suspects for removing name boards, but the police themselves are in violation of provisions of the Constitution. And the only answer that the ASP gave was, we don't have enough staff to write this in Tamil. So that says something about the genuineness of this whole concession, if you like, or they think of it as concession, not as rights. But even that, and until I think the majority community wholeheartedly sort of come to the point or realizes that this is a justice issue of equal citizenship of language. Look at India. They made a constitution through a constituent assembly. They were not given a constitution by Britain. But in 3 years, from 47 to 1950, they sat together and they made a constitution. And the idea was sharing of powers of governance, even if it cannot be called a full federal arrangement, on the concept of linguistic states. And that has stayed, because it was on the principle of linguistic states. Because language is so basically close to everyone, of their expression, of their interaction, all of that. And the idea of linguistic states has kept India together to this day. Look at Europe. Every country, you look at the political boundaries of countries, it's all language based. It's all language based. And even in countries where there are more than one language spoken, you have a federal arrangement. So there you have successful models if you want one. And so to those who say, why join the North and the East? Why can't they be separate? You join them because they are Tamil speaking areas. The idea of linguistic states. That's the only reason. The language identity or linguistic identity of that region. But even otherwise, I think unless government powers of governance are shared in some structured way like that, there is no redemption for this country. And once that realization comes, I think all communities, most importantly persons from the majority community must come along and fight this battle shoulder to shoulder with those who are numerically in the minority. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I think you focused on language, brought it back to the whole question of language, which was what the Satyagraha particularly targeted. You know, we've had two official languages and English as a linked language. We've also had an official language commission since 1990, I think. The official language commission was set up. And we have found in our work at CPA that there are a number of laws and indeed bylaws which are not translated into Tamil at all. And so, you know, there has to be a very definite political commitment on the part of any government with regard to this. The question I wanted to kick off the discussion with is language still important? Given that we are now moving towards AI and we're talking about globalization, digitalization, all of that, is language still important? Anyone? Is language still an issue? I know it's very much part of the identity of communities, certainly very much part of the Tamil community's identity. Sorry.
From the cultural reasons, I didn't know this myself till a few weeks ago. The members of the Colombo municipality turned up at my office to say that the municipal ordinance is not in the Tamil language. And I was shocked because I always assumed the municipal ordinance. And for the fact that they came to see me to say that it's not there surprised me. So apart from cultural issues, obviously it was important for them. But if somebody can throw a bit of light, apart from the examples he used about linguistic distinctions in a devolved government or decentralized government or whatever, in the Singapore case, how does it actually work? Because among the first principles Lee Kuan Yew set out at the beginning, he said everybody will study in English. Now, I'm not talking about practicality here, because you are also raising a conceptual issue. Is that actually possible? Then does it take care of that underlying push in a multicultural society? I'm also raising your question in a different way. What's the experience there? I just don't know.
Our fixation on Singapore is not great, I think, because it is an autocratic country for a start. And I've certainly worked in politics in Malaysia and Singapore, and it's a deeply troubled nation because it is, in many ways, monoethnic and unfairly so. So, to that extent, I don't think it's a great example. I could fill you in later about some of the tragic stories around it, but people are deeply unhappy if you belong to a different community, including possibly the president that should have been there, who was of Sri Lankan Tamil origin, would never make it because he was a Tamil.
Just responding to the question on whether language is important. I think in Sri Lanka, to both Tamils and those who speak Tamil and those who speak Sinhala, language is still deeply important, and it does offend both Tamils and Sinhalese. I think when their language is not, I would say, respected and not used properly and otherwise. So it is an emotional, and I guess, like you said, it is very, we express ourselves in our language, and therefore our political consciousness seems to come from that language, I think. So it is very important. I just want to um, go to your point in terms of what is the future and how does one actually engage the in a process where we work together towards change. And there, this I would push back on this. I'll ask another question. What would actually be a reason why the majority Sinhala speaking people of the country, and at this point I would say even a large proportion of the Tamil speaking people, actually politically ask for a federal or more devolved form of governance? Because I think there is a general tendency to believe that a centralized form of governance is much better, is easier, is more effective, right? I mean, even in the Tamil speaking areas, that would be the case. And I think it stems from very limited political literacy or understanding or participation. But how would we come to that point? One view that some have put forward is that devolution devolution is something that can help development, and that if it is presented not as something that will be you know, a rights issue or a justice issue or something given away to the Tamil speaking peoples, and more as a general development related issue that will help all, though that might not be the right thing to do or say, that might be a way of working towards that. Another question I have is actually that's relating to, I think, in terms of the federal party itself and the Tamil national or all the Tamil speaking people's position on this, is that when the Aragalaya did happen, we really didn't, and Sri Lankans were searching for an alternative. The alternative that was there was only the JVP NPP. We did not put forward an alternative, a federal alternative, an alternative where power would devolve or come from people, where people would have power. We didn't put that alternative forward, and we still don't put that forward as a national alternative, nor does any other political arrangement. We are all going back to, I mean, I think 21st of November is a good example of how the people saw this. Was all the Horas have gone back and they are protecting themselves. They don't see that as hope for the future. So we have an opportunity, I think, and I would ask, okay, do we have an opportunity to present a federal alternative, not in the terms of it being the term federal, because some colleagues would say that the moment the Sinhala polity hears this word, they see separation. They don't see devolved governance. They don't see development. They don't see working together. They see separation. Is there a way forward through that? Thank you.
The whole question of federalism, there was a time when we at CPA, we went around the country doing various awareness programs, etc., with regard to federalism. And one of the things that people said to us is, what is in it for us? Because they believed that federalism had come to be associated largely with a resolution of the ethnic conflict, not as a model of governance that was acceptable, that could be used by everyone. And so we need that, I think, to move it away from this notion that it is only about the ethnic conflict, to talk about it as a model of better governance, given that there is an emphasis, if you like, on governance at the present moment. Yes. Sorry, Jihan.
Yeah. I agree that language is very important, and people feel very sentimentally attached to it, and that's the way we communicate. And I don't think with AI still we don't have a way of talking in Tamil and being understood by the Sinhalese. Maybe a time will come when we'll have some chip or something where we can talk in our own language and the other person will understand. Because otherwise you can't communicate. So language, granted, it's very important. But language is not, now I'm addressing Suma's point about the merger. Language is not sufficient for the merger, I'm saying, because there is also the North and East is also Muslim. And from what I know, the Muslims have always been very hesitant and about the merger because they don't want to be under the Tamil in a merged entity. So that's one important point which we sometimes don't discuss. The second is of course the Sinhala. Sinhala also is part of has to agree, and if and it's and Neil's point of the path, the progression path, and once you go on a path, very difficult to reverse it. So for 70 years, we have gone on the path of saying, of Sinhalese identifying federalism and especially merger with separation, with the big threat. So given those two factors, I think merger would be problematic. And yeah, I mean, it probably, it might lead to no devolution at all. Now, I was actually once at a meeting long ago. Now Dr. Nesaya Devanesan is no longer here with us. But we met the LTT, Kittu and Rahim. I think we met Rahim. And the question of this merger came up. And Devanesan said, won't it be better if there was more power devolved, if you can get more power to the North and East separately than to the merge? And Rahim said, no, we want the merger. With even, he didn't say with less power, but he preferred all the Devanesan said, you can get more power, North and East separate, but Rahim said, no merger. And that's just by the way.
Yeah. No, just to let me answer your second question first. Given the fears of the majority community, yes, I do grant that the best way forward is to have 9 provinces as we have them in the constitution now, and it has worked for a while. So to have them as separate provinces, but as we do have in the constitution now, 2 provinces can, 2 or 3 adjacent provinces can resolve to amalgamate, and that provision can be there. Now, with regard to the Muslim question, yes, a large majority of them are fairly apprehensive as to why they should, they who are perhaps the single largest group in the eastern province at the moment, or thereabouts, why should they reduce their percentage to 17% if the provinces are merged? But I had the privilege, if you like, of delivering 2 memorial lectures this year. One was V. Dharmalinga Memorial Lecture in Jaffna, and the other was MHM Ashraf Memorial Lecture in Nindavur. And I found that in the 1972 model constitution that the Federal Party presented through Mr. Dharmalingam was identical to what Ashraf proposed as the five regions, devolution to 5 regions. Identical. There's an interview that Ashraf gave the Tamil newspaper Tinagaran, and so I voiced it in both places, particularly in the East at an SLMC convention kind of meeting, and it was there was no protest about that. So I think that issue can be resolved between those 2 communities, right? But because it also involves a southeastern region, a north and northeastern region, a north and northeastern region, and a southeastern region. Also with the possibility, like India, of non-contiguous regions. And if you look at APRC proposals, there is possibility of community councils that will work for the Tamils in the upcountry and other areas as well. So we can develop models that will cater to all that. But my first answer to your second question, I think, should be the way forward, that we don't, go into all of that, but go with what we have of the 9 provinces. And devolution in whatever form did take place, and we did have 9 provincial councils. So go back to that first.
I think one issue we have here is that when we talk about federalism, we're talking about the North and the Northeast versus the rest of the country. And maybe there has to be a discussion of federalism affecting the whole country. So, and that has to be emphasized that there are other areas of the country besides just, the Western province that also stands to benefit economically from federalism. And this, so I'll just not go on, but that was one point. Um, Another thing I think that, so as somebody who has been very, very critical of the path Sri Lanka has taken and the ethnocracy that has been instituted, I also recognize that all our communities suffer from a majoritarian kind of complex. If you go to Jaffna, there's kind of a majoritarian identity. Um, and part of that, I think, is reactionary. Those groups are reacting in a way to the dominant community and its emphasis on majoritarianism. Uh, the issue of India, India was mentioned in terms of the linguistic states. What a lot of people don't remember, I think, and I was not around at this time, it's based on my reading, Nehru was initially against linguistic states. But Nehru was also smart enough to want to compromise because Nehru's idea was keeping the union together. And whatever it took to keep the union together, Nehru was willing to kind of compromise on. But initially, Nehru thought that this was, a bad idea. Because within academia, the scholarship, goes both ways. There's this argument that gets made that federalism actually can lead to separatism. And there's also the argument that federalism actually prevents separatism from taking place. And I think the latter is the more proven example. Uh, One instance where federalism could have led, where accommodating the French language led accentuated Quebecois within, like, it was 49, 51 or something like that. Now, the reason that that has vitiated is not because the Quebecois have lost their love for French, it's because a lot of foreigners have moved into Quebec who prefer English over French. So if they were to have a referendum today, it's not going to be that close. Um, uh, Dr. Sumantharan, you can correct me if I'm wrong, and Sarah too. My reading kind of has suggested that there were Tamils who were willing to learn Sinhala in the north and were in the process of learning Sinhala in the north until 1956 happened. Because, many Tamils realized, they saw the writing on the wall, and they realized that if they were going to maintain, their links to, uh, going to access positions within the state, uh, going to access positions within the state, government service, it was to their advantage to learn some Sinhala. But it was when Sinhala only was kind of, thrown at them, that was when they quit learning it. And so I think there's this economic dimension. Language, of course, is intricately connected to identity, but it goes beyond identity. And so I just kind of I thought I'd make those points in regard to some of the comments that were made. Yeah.
I think it's also worth reminding ourselves that The Kandyan Sinhalese were also among the early proponents of a federal state. I think around 1933 when they made this proposal. I think it was Leonard Woolf around 29, and then you had the Kandyan Sinhalese. So that proposal also came from from the Sinhalese. Um, I just want to shift the discussion a little bit to another topic which came up, which is this whole question of protest movements and political transitions, which have been part of different parts of the world, as sort of Neil pointed out. So we had the Arab Spring, we had a sort of political transition in Indonesia, we now have it in Nepal and Bangladesh. And if you look at 2015 in Sri Lanka, that was also a moment of political transition. You had a government that came into power on a manifesto that was put together largely by civil society, in a way. But that political transition also failed. And I think, as civil society members concerned with democracy and constitutionalism and so on, it's also worth thinking about what sustains a transition. If you look now at Bangladesh and some of the problems that transitions over a long period of time, and I mean, I can only think of maybe two examples in Asia, maybe South Korea and Taiwan, which have actually transited from dictatorial and authoritarian regimes to more democratic. This dictator peacefully. Promise of that transition collapsed in a year. And it's the same now, right? So you bring in the NPP with its promises of abolishing the executive presidency, the PTA, the Online Safety Act, and so on, and then a year later you get, it seems like the NPP, is not willing to upset the apple cart in any way. It just wants to let the status quo go on. It doesn't want to take even Muslim personal law. It doesn't want to do anything in terms to what we all thought might show some sort of promise about asymmetrical federalism. But the demand for sort of governance, for power sharing, comes primarily from the north and the east. Region, or you're looking at two autonomous regions. I mean, one way to also start thinking about it is to think about asymmetrical federalism, sort of power sharing, where you start with one region, like what, say, Spain has been doing, and so on, and then you sort of move forward. It doesn't have to be symmetrical power sharing all the time. We can also try to think out of the box and look at sort of asymmetrical power sharing. And you may even want to think of like city states that some parts of the world are sort of working on, where you have a large municipality controlled and raising taxes and so on. So just to float the idea of asymmetrical federalism, I don't know how many people in Sri Lanka sort of looking forward.
Comments about it? Yes, Shai.
Sorry, just a quick response to that. I think the problem, or rather the reason as to why you see majority of the demand from the north and east for devolution, or rather the major response to devolution, is ethno-fractionalization. That is the main, thing when it comes to devolution. But we need to also reframe the conversation around devolution as localized governance, right? This is about the Western province, or those major political powers in the Western province, not deciding what's best in a particular for the rest of the country. Us not dictating for Jaffna, also not dictating, for the South as well. So that conversation needs to be reframed, right? And the other, political pushback to something like asymmetrical federalism is it'll very quickly become favoritism to the North and East. And that will be, a very, very different conversation and a can of worms that I don't think we should embark on. We need to embark on the fact that it is not purely about resolving the ethnic issue, but that goes back to how much we have made language as a part of that sort of trinity, how salient it has become in Sri Lankan society because it's politically instrumentalized for electoral gain. Right? When we look at 1956 onwards, these categories became so salient, even more so than they, normally would be, simply because they were used for electoral gain, because you had a very convenient, majority group of 70% that you just appeal to. And that has only increased with time the way our institutions have transformed, particularly with the executive presidency, because the spoils of that office have become so important to compete for that, you'll do anything to kind of get to that point. And, I would make the, sort of comparisons between Dutgamundu and the Rajpakshas, particularly at that height. That sort of, entrenchment of political power and Sinhala Buddhization that, we know very well. So I think we have to come back to, that argument and what are the ways in which we can change the incentives and disincentives to stop using ethnocentrism as this, political tool of mobilization, right? And that goes in tandem with the conversations around devolution, not just being about the ethnic issue, but about, communities itself.
Very, very briefly, I like to link our ideals. I mean, we are expressing ideals and talking about devolution, federalism, asymmetric, all that. We also need to link it, connect it in some way to what is actually happening on the ground with our government. And my sense is, I mean, my reading is that the government is not keen on devolution as we have known it, right? They are thinking of something else, and they have said it also in their manifesto. They said that they understand that the Tamils and Muslims believe in this system, but they really don't. But till they find a better system, they will use this. Now, so we have to think of that. Now, I mean, just to give one small example of how they are thinking. The Sri Lanka Day, one of the top officials from the bureaucracy. And I said, civil society likes to contribute to Sri Lanka Day, but we have not been informed. We have not been invited, nothing. We work with these interreligious groups, and that's one way we. No religion in Sri Lanka Day. They are not going to bring it in. I got quite surprised. I said, but Buddhism foremost place, all that, and no in Sri Lanka Day? No, we are not going to bring in Buddhism in any religion. So one can see in that their vision of solving this problem is actually more in the direction of a secular state. Maybe, I'm just reading, guessing. So, but I'm just putting this to you, that they are not very keen on devolution. They are keen on equal rights and non-discrimination. I think they'll be very firm on that as far as it's possible within a centralized Sinhala-dominated system. And maybe going in the direction of a secular state also, which is something we like and hold to.
Professor Padmanathan, would you like to say a few words?
Professor can't actually hear, so that's why I was talking loudly to him, and then everyone.
Would you like to say a few words?
Speak a few words.
Well, looking back at history, 100 years is in our 2,500 years of. So, in our of history under monarchy, we have developed exemplary trial management. So, I don't feel that the majority of this country against the Tamil people and is against conceding to them their legitimate assents. And even in the recent past, two heads of governments came closest to meeting the aspirations of the Tamil people. I think the representatives of Tamil party also are here. They will not contradict me. Under Mrs. Chandrika Kumaratunga, all once and for all. And the draft constitution of 2000, which was prepared jointly by Professor G.L. Pires and my friend Neelan Tiruchelvam, under the guidance of the President, almost came to meet all these aspirations And if there was a referendum, there would have been a 95% endorsement by the Tamil people. Unfortunately, this did not happen. And then there was this Oslo Declaration. I don't want to go back on what happened earlier. So Mr. Ranil Wickremesinghe and Balasingham signed this declaration. What was the intention? To solve this national ethnic issue on the principles of federalism. Sinhalese people did not oppose that. In fact, Ranil was not defeated by the Sinhalese vote. Tamils were prevented from voting. Otherwise, he would have won by about 7 lakhs of votes, and maybe that he did not have the courage and of Chandrika Kumaratunga, but this so-called LTT would not have been eliminated, and the Tamil people would not have come to the crossroads. So what we have now to do is to make the Tamil people, dissuade them, and move away from the politics of the past, the politics of military culture, gun culture. I don't want to say I was in Jaffna during that time. I got fed up and gave up my professorship, returned to Peradeniya because I was so disgusted with what was going on. The Tamil people are not for separation. It was forced on them by the 1972 Constitution. And I will now say the 1972 Constitution is no more in respect of the language provision. When, of course, they also came to an agreement. Government came to an agreement and to recognize the Tamils as a nationality. Of course, you don't say everything you see outwardly. It is a substance that matters. So now what is important is, I don't agree with many of my friends in politics, although I appreciate their oratorical talents, that you must ask for federalism as a condition. If you say federalism, they will say unitary setup. There should not be any condition for negotiation. But what is problem is this ekkiya that is not in the Sinhalese vocabulary, political vocabulary. They had their own vocabulary for united Sri Lanka. And at the same time, we should abandon these emotional attachments and accept the principles of the Oslo Declaration, that is, the substance of federalism, which is decentralization of power. And personally, I think that Mrs. Kumaratunga, like her father, wanted a political participatory democracy that requires a three-stage participation of the people, that is a government and the presidency. We want to abolish the presidency. Then the regional councils, you call them whatever name you like, and then we have the regional local councils, which will be vested with certain powers which cannot be taken. That's the issue. Of course, in the Indian Constitution, although it is said it is a unitary constitution, Ambedkar has himself, but the courts, the Supreme Court considers that the states also have powers and inviolable powers, and thereafter the central government had desisted from dissolving the state assemblies. The problem is there is the powers of the governor. Powers of the governor, they are not resulting in ethnic conflict. Here it is a different situation. The power of the governor's powers, as envisaged in the draft constitution of 2000, should be vested with the council. If that is done, I think there is nothing further to discuss about it. So there must be, and if you want